The Luminous Mind, bonus edition.
It's not just about what you include in education, it's about what you exclude.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Steve Adams. Steve holds a degree in business and education with a Ph.D. in foundations of education from Florida State University. He's taught at and directed private and virtual schools in Idaho and Utah. He's also started businesses supporting the startup and operation of choice schools. He has served as the Director of Charter, Virtual, and Home Education for the Florida Department of Education and is currently working with BYU Idaho in the online and pathways programs. He served as a United States Marine Corps Reserve, and he lives in Sugar City with his wife and 7 children. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you for having me.
So before I have you tell our audience about yourself, one of the reasons why I've known Steve for quite a while, we go back quite a ways, when we were actually working on our own charter school, he was a mentor for us. And so I've known Steve, how long?
It's been a while.
11 years or something, 12 years.
Yeah.
So it's been a while. And your path has gone in many different places. You ended up down in Florida and stuff. But do you want to just briefly tell us about yourself and your family?
You bet. My wife and I are both from Eastern Idaho. We met actually when we met. She was teaching at a little private school, and that got me interested in education again after working on my undergraduate in business. And I've been involved ever since with either private schools or charter schools or virtual schools, and had a wonderful ride. Gotten to know a lot of great people, a lot of amazing educators who want to serve parents and students, and it's a lot of fun.
And so with your wife, I had no idea that she did private schooling. So then that got you interested in maybe alternative education, right?
Yeah, the alternative ed kind of has its own meaning in the world, but it got me into diverse systems and diverse approaches to education. It's amazing. I spoke the other day to a group of secondary ed students here at the university, and it was hard to communicate because a lot of them had never seen a different kind of educational system. And to try and describe a truly unique private system or the desires of a minority population in Miami that's trying to pursue their own charter school with their own values and goals, it's hard to understand if you've never seen it.
Yeah, I think maybe unless you have kids that are going through the system, maybe the passion for that's not there or something. I don't
tell a system that you're involved with begins to conflict with your own values.
Yeah, exactly. So, and just give us a brief resume of how you got involved in charter schools, because you were the director of a charter school here, and I didn't know you were the director of virtual schools. So
well, I've worked in administration in virtual schools.
Oh, okay.
And as a consultant. I may have even phrased that wrong when I sent you that bio. But so I started with the private schools, and there was a little school called the Benjamin Franklin Academies back in the day, and I worked with them. And then when we came to Idaho, we started a little private school in Blackfoot and enjoyed that experience. That was one of the purest educational experiences I've ever had. We had young children and a baby, and we'd pass the baby around to the students, and it was a pretty phenomenal, amazing opportunity. And we were very poor and didn't make any money. And I kind of felt like I sold out a little bit when a charter school group there in Blackfoot asked me to help with their business operation. It was kind of interesting going into education with a business degree. When these charter schools started to open, they had a lot of great educators, but very few of them knew how to operate a business or even a nonprofit or how to do fund-based accounting that's required for the charter schools. And so I found a nice niche working with them, and then they asked me to be their director. And shortly into that experience, a group in a neighboring school district asked me to help start a high school. And it was right after we started that high school that I met you and your husband, and we worked on that school and did a few others here in Idaho and worked with some down in Utah as a consultant. that was a great experience. And from there, I went to Florida to work with the Florida Department of Ed and helped with their charter schools, virtual schools, and home education. And then when I finished my master's and started on my Ph.D., I needed more time for schoolwork. And so I left the department, went back into consulting, started a little business providing services for charter schools and helping startups and working with, I know a couple of the big virtuals are K-12 and Connections Academy. I worked with Connections Academy, dialoguing with districts in Florida, and had a really good experience working for some management companies and virtual companies. And then I had the chance to come back to Idaho and work with BYU Idaho. So that's my kind of educational journey, professional anyways.
Great. And one of the reasons why I asked Steve to come on, and he's written a dissertation entitled Liberty and the Conscience of Mass Education. Did I say that correctly? I said it wrong.
Liberty of conscience.
Of conscience. Okay. Liberty of conscience and mass schooling. And it's just really an intriguing topic, with your background working, because charter schools are public schools, right? And virtual schools. Yeah, are typically run through the government. Did you see problems when you were working with the bureaucracies of government trying to get some of these non-traditional type schools started?
Yeah, the stories there would be endless.
And I have never. Did you work in the charter movement? Were you there with my sister and some of those beginning? Were you part of that group or?
I'm just trying to remember his name. The gentleman who sponsored the charter school legislation in Boise.
Oh, I can't remember.
Can't remember his name anymore. But I had worked with him on a school voucher, actually tuition tax credit and dual enrollment I'm not going to get his name right, so I better. Fred Tillman. Is that right?
Oh, that sounds correct, or at least the Tillman.
I might get him mixed up with, switch names with another guy I worked with in Florida. But I'd worked on things like that and been interested in it. And I did look at some drafts of charter school legislation, and I've never been a big fan of charter schools to that point. I've always had a problem with the government part of public education. Always liked public education. I just didn't understand why it had to be controlled and monopolized by the government. So when I got involved with charter schools, it was actually very hesitantly. And in fact, one of the schools I helped start, that high school, the parents, after I went to Florida, the board members actually were under so many requirements from the state that they gave up the charter.
Yeah. And like you said, they don't have business degrees, but there is a lot of obstacles that they put in front of charter schools.
The case with this school was the state had changed a lot of the requirements that were in the charter and were requiring them to use adopted textbooks and things. And they felt that was not in line with their charter mission, and so the parents voluntarily gave up the charter. But
wow, that's crazy. So
another important aspect of that I came to learn in Florida. I mean, Eastern Idaho has its diversity, but it's not nearly as culturally diverse as Florida, and especially South Florida. And as I got to know these groups in Florida that were striving to educate their community and work together as local citizens to help better their children's experience, they really struggled. They didn't understand why generally applicable educational goals had to be their goals. Why goals decided upon by the majority in Tallahassee had to be their goals. They didn't, and I couldn't understand it either. It doesn't make sense. Yeah. That people who are striving to better their lives have to accept external controls on their educational system.
Yeah, and who's the almighty educational authority that decides those things? It's a frustrating matter. And isn't that the point of trying to provide a school of choice, is that it's supposed to be different than, what we're seeing in the traditional schools? And sometimes when we have bureaucracy that we have to appease, we end up with a school that almost mimics our traditional schools, which is what we're trying to do, is offer a choice.
Yeah. And what limited options we did have in the charter school movement, we even coined a term for it, which is re-regulation.
Yeah.
We were exempt from state rules here in Idaho, and now we're really not. As they write new rules and as they write new legislation, they always include the charter schools. And that's kind of the way of centralized planning. It's just the way it works. And there is still a little opportunity to do some unique things in charter schools, but you'll find that Common Core and this new testing that we're moving into is going to dramatically reduce that as well.
Yeah. Well, and the other side of that is that they require the regulation, but they don't help with the funding on that. We get a reduced amount, plus we have to try to come up with a facility with that amount that a traditional school would just do a property tax bond for. So
lots of fun stuff.
Yeah. Anyway, well, I guess we should get back to your dissertation. Do you want to give us the background for selecting this focus? And we've kind of talked about what your experience has been, but...
Yeah, and personally, I'd had what in the dissertation is referred to as a felt difficulty. It's a framework that John Dewey kind of described for the work in philosophy of education. But when I was in high school, I was in a highly Mormon or LDS high school, and I always wondered why we had to leave our school, walk across the parking lot, go to another property in another building to learn about religion. And from my own doctrinal background, I didn't understand the distinction between the worldly knowledge and religion. To me, it was all one thing. Knowledge is knowledge. It's useful or it isn't. And I always wondered about that. And then, there are legal answers to that question, but I wondered about it more principally. And then I thought about students that lived in areas where they were the minority. And what if you were the only kid at your high school and you had to leave your school, go somewhere else for another type of learning, and then come back? And I wondered about, what kind of message is that sending socially to minorities? That you're not welcome, that your ideas don't matter? Are we giving them preferred space in our legal systems and in our social systems? What I decided to do when I got to Florida was to go and pursue graduate studies. And I decided to really ask these questions and to ask them of people who didn't understand my background, people who were not LDS, people who lived in a very different world than I did, who were more traditional educators and well-educated. And I openly pursued these questions with them and looked at their challenges to my ideas and started to understand that there were a lot of other people asking the same questions just from their perspectives. And even authors, very well-known and respected authors, had touched on these ideas. And two that I really took a liking to, one of them was Martha Nussbaum, and she wrote a book called Liberty of Conscience. And another one that I really liked was Religion and American Education by Warren Nord. And it's interesting, they don't really address my topic particularly, but they do address the issues. And so what I thought I could do for my dissertation was to pull ideas both from those books and from a theory of religious intolerance that's all from a professor there at FSU that I took classes from in the religion department, and apply those to education specifically. And the title is Liberty of Conscience in Mass Education or Mass Schooling because of Martha Nussbaum's book. Hers is central to my thesis.
Oh, that's great. So with your study, just give us a brief synopsis. Do you really think that we can separate the church and state? Can we really have a secular education where you pull it out?
Let me address the secular education first. The origins of the common school movement are interesting to study. Schooling in the colonies and in the early United States were almost exclusively religious. Even what they would term scientific or progressive education was very religious. And when we start looking at the common school movement, this was not an argument between secularism and religionists or naturalists and scientists. It had nothing to do with that, or naturalists and religionists. The argument was which religion should have control of the educational experience. And the arguments, the rhetorical, political arguments for common schools that were popular in the newspapers and publicly were anti-Catholic, anti-Mormon arguments. And this is something that is clearly described by almost every historian of American education. There is this isn't a fringe idea. The birth of the common school system in this country is directly tied to religious intolerance.
Wow. That's interesting.
And there's some good rationale for that if you think about it. Or I don't know if it's good, but it's logical. So you have an American system of liberty that was born out of the Protestant desire to read and individually interpret the Bible.
Yeah, and most of our schools, way back, that's where you would go to learn was to a church, to the priests or whatever. So religion way back was tied to education was tied to religion way back. They were the ones writing the books. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. And as our country began to, accept in a lot of immigrants and things began to change a little bit politically, you have in places like New York a high influx of Catholic immigrants. And you have this idea that, they even label them and call them lackeys of the Pope, and you can't have freedom if you have Catholic control of our social systems because they're lackeys of the Pope. They don't think for themselves. They don't believe in liberty. And these are all religiously intolerant causes of the desire for the common school system. And in New York, you even had, when they started to have publicly funded schooling for the poor, those funds were actually distributed to Catholic, Protestant, Baptist schools the same. But after this movement for common education, which means common culture, you had a drive for common culture, which also requires the destruction of minority cultures through intolerance and a lot of other things. But after that happened, you ended up with a form of Protestant public or government schools in New York, and the exclusion of the funding of your Catholic schools and your Bethel Baptist organization. And this was a turning point. And from then on, in this country, you basically have central planning for education, and you have it controlled by a political majority. And for a long time, that was a Protestant majority. But as things began to change in the country, the system didn't change. It's still controlled by a majority. It's just no longer an overtly or clearly religious majority. And that's why in the dissertation, I talk about a concept called epistemic intolerance. It doesn't matter whether the majority theory of knowledge is religious or scientific or any other form of knowledge. What matters is that one form of knowledge is given higher standing and endorsement by the government, and then it is required that all citizens begin to be incorporated into that theory of knowledge through a mass system of centralized public education.
Wow. So you're basically saying that we really can't have a secular education, that it ends up being a Protestant type religion. Is that correct?
No, that was the beginning. Okay. Was the Protestant control of a centrally planned system. But now we have what people claim in many areas is a secularly controlled system of centralized education. But Warren Nord addressed that topic very well. It's not just about what you include in education, it's about what you exclude. And when you're trying to not be religiously intolerant or discriminatory in an educational system, you can't achieve that by just excluding religious ideas.
Yeah, I mean, they've banned certain books and stuff like that because they want to exclude. I mean, there's an awful lot of censorship. Is that correct?
There is, both in and a lot of what I would argue is religious intolerance in both what is included as mandatory for everyone and what is excluded for everyone. There's a lot of control in deciding what is and is not included in a centralized system of education.
Wow. Yeah.
In fact, I argue, I think fairly well, that it could be an incredibly powerful tool of tyranny.
Yeah, that's true. Well, in a lot of ways, when we pull out the religion, we do create a religion of atheism. And almost, like you said, with tyranny, almost that the government, we put them in the place of the God. Instead of talking about God in the classroom, we put the government as the central figure for that place of deity almost. Would you agree with that? Or?
I would say it just a little differently, but it's the same idea. And that is that the issue isn't whether it's religious or not. The issue is what theory of knowledge is driving the system. And if we're going to be a free society, we need to have different versions or different frameworks of knowledge. Different theories of knowledge need to be allowed. They need to have place. And if you have only one theory of knowledge driving one educational system, it doesn't matter whether it's scientific, religious, philosophical, it's inappropriate in a free society.
Yeah.
And in fact, you can't have a free society if you're doing that. And it's something that we have done, and it's very dangerous. So right now, it's not a religious, and they have a word for theories of knowledge. It's epistemology. And so it's not a religious epistemology that's driving and is the framework of our educational system right now. It's what people would call it a secular theory of knowledge based in science and philosophy and different things. But it doesn't make it right just because it's not religious. Nor does it mean that it's not, nor is it tolerant. People would argue, well, because it's secular, it's tolerant of minority cultures. It's not. It was actually designed to norm out minority cultures.
And so you basically slough out the First Amendment, where somebody who is a minority of a certain religion isn't allowed to talk about their beliefs. Is that correct? I mean, there's censorship on what they can say.
And we'll say, we say that, you're welcome to bring your beliefs with you into a public school, but that's not really true. Because
they catch kids praying and they...
If you're teaching in a public school, do you have the right to bring your beliefs into the public school? Definitely not. You're acting as an agent of the state. You can't do that. And if you're a student and you bring your religious ideas in, those ideas have systematically been worked out of the curriculum. Other ideas have a preferred status within the system, and you're bringing those ideas in after those ideas have already been delegitimized through the system. So you're in an unequal, inferior social space when you bring those into the system. And so in reality, you do not have the full freedom of bringing and exploring and pursuing your religious or any other type of idea that has been excluded from the public school system.
This is a great time to take a break.
Hey, Firestarters, this is Mark, producer of The Luminous Mind. If you're like me, the thought of going out to the store and shopping is enough to make you want to crawl in a hole and hide. If that's you, then do your shopping online through Amazon. Just go to theluminousmind.net, click on the Amazon link, and shop away. Also, most of the books and resources that Rebecca and her guests discuss can be found on our Amazon links as well. Again, if you're like me, you have already accidentally signed up for Amazon Prime. So most of those purchases should have free shipping as well. Good luck!
Welcome back. Let's start. I don't know if we've outlined your thesis very well. If you want to go into that.
I haven't done that yet.
Let's outline that. And why is that important? That's the big question. Why people can't bring their religious ideas in. I'm sure we'll touch on that as we go through.
Yeah, that's more of a legal argument. I'm happy to address it kind of at the end because I kind of think it's irrelevant. We've built that framework as a society. We can unbuild it. It's not based on any kind of eternal principle.
Okay.
So I started my thinking with, it's a theory of religious intolerance. And it was in a class I took from Dr. Corrigan there in the religion department. But it was an interesting class. The LDS faith came up a lot as a group that had been treated intolerantly in American history. But it goes back much, much further. And the beginnings of this academic discipline go back to colonial approaches to South America, Central America, North America, South Africa, and it put together a cycle or a theory of religious intolerance. It starts with the society establishing what is normal, identification of the normative ideal. And from there, it moves into this space socially where the normal is differentiated from the abnormal or the undesirable or the deviant. And after there is this differentiation, there is then a concerted effort by those that hold themselves to be normal or the majority to delegitimize that which is different.
That is an interesting concept.
Well, and I've learned it doesn't just apply to religions, but it's something that they've identified. And as part of this delegitimization process and also kind of a dehumanation process, something that I labeled narrativization. Sorry, I can't even say some of these words. Basically, constructing stories or narratives or labels about the other that helps with their delegitimization, dehumanization, and allows for the next step, which is the annihilation of the other.
Wow.
And this was done in gross violence early in history. So these colonial efforts resulted in the slaughtering of entire cultures.
Wow.
Now, that was a serious deal when you read those books. But I asked myself the question, is education, could it be just a kinder, gentler way of annihilating minority cultures? And so I pursued that. And in my pursuit of that, I came across Martha Nussbaum's work on liberty of conscience. So while she's not talking expressly about religious intolerance, she's talking about a lot of concepts that she labels liberty of conscience. And it's very consistent with the early arguments for religious liberty, being able to pursue your own version of the good life, being able to make your own determinations about what you value and what you want to pursue. Now, these were, in the founding era, religious arguments, because all theories of knowledge were basically religious. But over time, we've developed other epistemologies that are not religiously based. And so it's much simpler in our day to talk about liberty of conscience instead of talking about religious liberty, because religious liberty would be far too narrow in our day, because there are a lot of theories of knowledge that are not religious. So in looking at that, in reading her work and studying what she was doing, she found that there are two necessary conditions for liberty of conscience. One is the freedom of the individual to choose her own version of the good life. And the second is equality and equity under the law, which requires the absence of favored status as determined by official actions which lead to direct or indirect legitimization or delegitimization of one status or another. And I found that intriguing.
Yeah, that is.
Because it puts in secular terminology the concepts of religious intolerance, but in a secular philosophical language that almost anyone can pursue. And I actually purposefully only chose more humanist, secular, progressive, even politically liberal sources for these arguments, because I find that being able to argue in those people's language is helpful.
Yeah, because I guess that's where I was driving at before, is that maybe some people don't understand why. I mean, I guess a lot of us feel like, education, you should be able to converse with people and understand what they're talking about. So there should be some sort of common understanding, and they may not feel like who cares if we don't study a person's religion or they don't have that as an option, as long as we can all communicate with one another. Does that make sense? Or
it does. It's just flawed dramatically.
Yeah.
Not what you're saying, but the theory.
That
we can have this social shared space where we study general things and it won't have any effect on minority cultures. Warren Nord and many other writers have shown that to be absolutely false. It's what you exclude becomes even more important than what you include in those allowable conversations in this public space. And if your topic of interest is not allowed inclusion, it's now been delegitimized. And because it's never included in the educational space, it will cease to exist over time.
And
it's a very important, I shouldn't say it will, it is highly likely that it will cease to exist. These are consistent with the efforts to Christianize the Native Americans through forced relocation and mission schools. The idea that the northerner carpetbaggers who came down to the South knew better than the freed slaves as to how they should run their educational systems, and shut down the private schools that had been created by the freed slaves and enforced their own types of public education on the blacks in the South.
Wow.
And for Mormon history, you have the confiscation of church schools and assets in the Utah Territory and the forced participation in now a centrally controlled government system that did not reflect the values and goals of that community. It's a consistent revisiting of this concept throughout American history, beginning with the common school movement. So when you look at, the phrasing common school or normal school is another phrase for that, they were seeking to create a common culture or a normative, normal, and you think about that cycle of religious intolerance, the first step, establishing that which is normal, you're now calling it a normal school. It is a total departure from the concept of liberty. And very specifically, it is a departure from the concept of liberty of conscience.
Wow.
It's very interesting to me. Now, she had a couple of other things that I thought were really useful. So she had another thing that she establishes. There is one required role for government, and government's role is as a guarantor of protected space for the pursuit of liberty of conscience. Now, that's a very consistent argument with what libertarians would argue politically. And then you have also two allowable restrictions on liberty of conscience: that which is necessary to preserve public order and that which is necessary to protect the rights of others. And I just find that whole framework to be amazing, because if we actually pursued public education within that framework, we would have respect for liberty. We would have the government guaranteeing protected space for everyone's values and goals in education, not just the majorities. And we really would then have real, useful school choice.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, there is this argument out there that, well, there has to be some common cultural values or we can't have civilized society. So I think there is some rationality to that argument. But in American culture, in the early days, that uniting value was liberty, respect for liberty of conscience, the respect for freedom of religion.
And the respect for you have a right to pursue your own happiness regardless of if I agree with it or not type of attitude.
And that is enough of a shared cultural value to keep a civilized society together. It was proven in the founding era. These diverse colonies unified and created a new nation with that shared value. I actually think that most of the time when we're arguing about these shared values, we're going right back to the arguments for common schools, which were that if we don't get rid of the Catholics and the Mormons and these other deviants, then we're not going to be able to have civilized society. Yeah. And that is purely a religiously intolerant counter to liberty argument.
Yeah. And we see the peace that it brought the Nazis, trying to get rid of, like, the Jews. I guess that's what I keep thinking is that when you say that, trying to get rid of a certain demographic, I think of that situation.
Well, and I think it's in human nature for some reason that we have this desire to separate ourselves from the other and to even do away with that which makes us uncomfortable or that which is different from us. Now, do I think it's progress that our society is pursuing that through social norming educational pursuit rather than mass murder and genocide? I think that's progress. But I also think that we should police ourselves a little bit and realize that we don't need to destroy that which is not us.
Yeah, that leads to
allow
scary.
Other people to pursue their own ideas without it threatening us.
Yeah.
So in this dissertation, what I did then is, after reviewing the literature in several different academic disciplines, religious intolerance, philosophy of education, education policy, both, this work from Martha Nussbaum was kind of one of my foundational projects. And then I looked at all of the possible, well, not all, but all of them I could think of that were legitimate counter arguments to my thesis and covered those in the literature and then presented my arguments for that. And the rest of the dissertation is just working through all these different arguments and basically applying Martha Nussbaum's liberty of conscience to those arguments and working through them. And the conclusion I come up with is you cannot have respect for liberty of conscience if you do not have diversity in your educational offerings.
Wow, yeah. So I'd really like to I think we've gone through quite a bit from what I'm seeing. Anyway, I'd really like to see what your conclusion is, with the choice and possibility options. We kind of talked about some of the problems of keeping religion out of the schools. Is that right? The problem of official sanction goals and rules. Maybe we could go into that a little bit. And then I want to hear maybe what your felt difficulty revisit is with, what you think we could do to get religion back into the education.
Well, actually, let's start with that one.
Okay.
I don't think our goal should be to get religion back into education. I think that would be just as harmful as what we're doing now.
So you're definitely not in support of like a voucher that would give parents, where they could take the money and then go to...
I see that as a very different thing that I am supportive of.
Okay.
So let's go back and realize that the first common schools we had, the first centralized schools we had run by the government, were Protestant schools. So there is an argument out there that we should return to religious public schools, which in essence mean that we would go back to a centralized universal school system that teaches some form of religion.
But that's normative, that makes the Protestant...
Exactly the same problem we have right now, and I do not support that. Now, what I do support is diversity, and the government providing protected space for any social group to pursue their own goals based on their own values for education. Now, that model looks a lot like vouchers or tuition tax credits, or I actually think it could be a more fundamental restructuring of public education. And I had listened to one of your guests on one of your podcasts who talked about, the problem of the Blaine amendments.
Yeah.
It's a very real problem. And that Blaine Amendment was born out of the same anti-Catholic, anti-Mormon rhetoric that the Common School movement was born out of. They're one and the same. They're all the same movement.
Yeah.
And so Idaho has this part in their constitution that would restrict doing some of these very things. And most states do, because they all adopted these Blaine Amendments that were highly problematic when you're trying to think about supporting liberty. So anyway, that's kind of the essence of what it gets to, is to say what we should be doing as a society, if we want a free society, is we should be maximizing liberty of conscience and minimizing necessary restrictions on liberty of conscience. And that's a fundamentally different approach to public education than we're taking now. Right now, all the political fights are over who gets to control. Who gets the control of this big monster? Who gets to publish the texts? Who gets to assess the standards? Who gets to create the standards? And they all have to be centrally controlled and administered. That is not freedom.
No. So we talk about the First Amendment, being able to have a freedom of speech. I mean, that really does begin with your ideas, of what you're allowed to study. And if we're not letting children study, what their belief system is, then it definitely hampers liberty in that First Amendment.
Yeah, that's actually a fun issue to get into. One of the arguments I dealt with in mine is this idea that we should educate for autonomy, that every child should have the freedom to choose between options, and it shouldn't be up to the parents to decide, what version of the good life that child is going to have to pursue. Well, there's some serious flaws to that idea. And it basically rests on the idea that this assumption that we're actually exposing children to diverse cultures and interests in a centralized common school system, which is totally flawed, and that we're giving them the tools to choose between these autonomous, self-governing cultures, which isn't true at all. We have a normed culture through generations of centralized educational systems, and if they do choose to pursue something different, then they are immediately delegitimized by the system that is supposed to be educating them for this choice. It actually, if you allow authentic, diverse cultures in a free society, those cultures will interact. You don't have to create a norming common school system for those cultures to interact. And then allowing these cultures to actually exist in reality without external manipulation by a government norming system, then you are much likely to actually allow these children to choose another way of life that is authentic, not controlled by the majority, much more likely to do that in a diverse educational set of systems than you are through a centralized norming educational system.
Yeah. If everyone can come together and agree on the old two laws of that you're not supposed to take other people's things or do them any harm, we could all speak our minds openly. And then, like you said, if we really believe in that freedom with those two laws, I've got to find it. I'm totally paraphrasing and it sounds horrible.
While you're looking for that, the general conclusion that I reach is, let me start with John Dewey's definition of education, one way he defined it. He defined it as the process by which social groups maintain their continuous existence. That can either be progressive in that they're trying to change their system over time to make it better, or it could be conservative. They're trying to recreate that same system over time. But that's what education is. It's the process by which a social group maintains its existence, cultural existence. So now let's look at that theory of religious intolerance. If your cultural group as a minority is denied the tools of cultural reproduction, which is education, will your culture continue to exist over time?
No.
And so I basically come back to that theory of religious intolerance and say it's not just a theory of religious intolerance, it's a theory of epistemic intolerance.
Yeah.
And if your epistemology, your theory of knowledge does not align with the majority, it will systematically be delegitimized and then annihilated over time by denying your cultural group the tools of cultural reproduction.
That's interesting. And it probably makes sense that down in Florida, they were more concerned about that than necessarily here, where everyone shares. I mean, not that we all share the same religion, because just like the podcast that I was talking about with Brianna LeClaire, and, she was talking about all the diversity that we have in Idaho, we've actually, because we have one population that is maybe has the majority on the religion, we've pretty much sloughed out the other populations for that. But maybe that's why the people in Florida were a little more conscientious of that, because they're a lot more diverse.
Well, and it might have to do with time in country too. We tend to think we're kind of monolithic here in Idaho, but if you look at immigrant populations in Idaho, they're not culturally homogenous. And if you go to Florida, you have a much greater and more recent immigration pool from a lot of different countries. And you also have these little cultural communities within different areas in Florida where they've maintained their culture a little bit better, even with some of the common schooling systems. So I actually think we would be much more diverse in Idaho if we didn't have this social norming enterprise going on over the last 3 or 4 or 5 generations.
Yeah, exactly. So the 2 laws are: do all that we've agreed to do and do not encroach on another person's property. So if everyone had that belief, but we all had a different value system or different religious set that we were coming from, then we could actually have a discussion about this and not have it turn violent. So
I think those are very similar to what Martha Nussbaum is saying, in that government's role should be to protect social space for the pursuit of liberty of conscience, and that we should not restrict liberty of conscience unless it's absolutely necessary to protect the rights of others, and that makes total sense. That's the definition of a free society.
Yeah.
If you're running around saying, well, we have to violate each other's liberty in order to have liberty, that's a ridiculous argument.
Exactly. So how do we do a radical change? At the very end of your thesis, you talk about how do we make that change? I mean, you were just telling me you approached all these young people in secondary education, and you're telling them all of this about the private school, but it just completely, they seem dumbfounded by it because they had all been raised one particular sort of education. How do we make that radical change, do you suggest?
I think we have to start by talking about what is a free society. What is liberty? And we have so many perverted definitions of that nowadays, where we begin to call that which is black white and that which is white black. Liberty is uncomfortable. Liberty is messy. In a system that respects liberty, you don't all agree. You do disagree.
You have debate.
You have tension. You have debate, you have argument, and those are all part of a free society. When you've all been normed into submission, that is no longer a free society.
Yeah, the old, there's 2 things that you don't discuss, and that's religion and politics, but what else? I mean, is that really freedom when you can't discuss those things? And that's how we've been normed in a way, is that we believe that having a difference of opinion of somebody is necessarily a bad thing.
Or disagreeing with a certain practice or policy. I am kind of arguing the extreme on this, but if you look at what's going on in the Common Core, I don't have a problem with most of the standards that are listed one at a time. What I have a problem with is the idea that we should force those standards upon everyone, everywhere.
Yeah.
That's not liberty. That's not freedom.
That education can only look one way,
Yeah, and you can only have one set of values driving one set of goals, and that enforcement can only be done through one type of assessment.
Yeah.
It is an argument that is totally contrary to the idea of liberty of conscience, the political concept of freedom. They cannot exist in the same space.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I really appreciate you coming on with us today. Tell us how we can go ahead and get in touch with you.
You bet. You can find me on Facebook, just Stephen Adams. You can find me, I work at BYU Idaho, and I'm in their system. Anybody can feel free to contact me that way. Either way, it's fine.
Great. And with your dissertation, is it going to be available for general public?
Yeah, I selected the option to make it generally available, so you don't have to pay to read that monstrosity. It's honestly not written the way I would write that for a general audience. It's written for a group that sit on a committee at a university, and it's kind of written in their language and in their verbiage.
But it does have some interesting concepts, I think, that a lot of people don't tackle these days.
If you're willing to dig through the clutter, you might find some useful radical stuff.
Yeah. Oh, well, I thought it was very interesting. So I think when you finally do something as radical as homeschooling, you do really realize how your rights are limited, you know, when you go outside of that norm. And that, at least that's where my paradigm had to change, is that I chose to do something different, and you get a lot of feedback from that, and you realize that, yeah, I guess that doesn't fit within the norm. Of what people think.
You realize a couple of things. One, that freedom provides unlimited, amazing opportunities. Two, that freedom is difficult and painful and hard to pursue. And you also come to learn what delegitimized social space means.
Yeah.
You're no longer socially legitimate in a lot of areas.
Yeah, you do. You get a lot of people staring at you like you're weird.
And
you do realize how your freedom is very, it's very fragile. You know, I mean, legislation could come in tomorrow that makes this illegal. And then all of a sudden what I'm doing is no longer, you know, it's no longer acceptable. And I could face, you know, jail time and lose my freedom altogether.
Well, in a lot of ways, it's already not acceptable. So the government has already told you that the economic resources taken from everyone to pursue public education are not available to you.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're told that, well, yeah, you're still free to pursue it, but after you've already given of your resources to this pool for education, you now have to do it again, which we called that double taxation when it was impacting the freed slaves in the South. And yet we do it all the time. We tell people, oh, you can go to private school, you can homeschool, but you can only do that if you're placed in an economically disadvantaged status.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fun discussion.
Oh, it's been fun. I appreciate you thinking of me and letting me talk through my crazy ideas.
I think it's great. So thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about us, go to our website, theluminousmind.net. You can also click on the Fire tab to be a fire starter yourself. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content by subscribing to our channel in iTunes as well as on YouTube. Light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.